We're continuing our partnership with Learn Liberty this week. As you guys know, we're building out our home studio right now, and my good pal Larry King was nice enough to lend me his studio. My old studio used to be built in this very room, but Larry lent it to us today. My guest this week is an author, the education editor at Spiked, and senior lecturer of higher education and academic practice at the University of Kent. Joanna Williams, welcome to the Rubin Report.
Hi, thanks for having me.
I'm very excited to talk to you because we are going to talk about education. That might be the most important thing out there. Is that fair to say?
I think it is, and I think what's really interesting is how much more important it seems to have become over just a very few years. It seems like if everybody feels a need to go to university nowadays, and parents are always so worried about how well their children are doing at school, and I think that's quite new. I don't think it used to be the case. Go back 20 years, I don't think it was quite the case that everybody felt they had to go to university and people were so pressurized about how well their kids were doing at school.
Yeah, so before we get to the pressure situation and all the stuff that you talk about related to it being more about grades than learning and credits and all that stuff, how about you basically just define education for me? What do you think is actually a good, well-rounded education?
Well, I think education should be about knowledge. You should know more when you leave school than you do when you start at school.
Right, that makes sense. So far I'm with you.
Well, do you know what? You say it makes sense, but it's actually a very controversial thing to say, and I've been challenged upon this so much, because as soon as you say kids should know more when they leave school than they do when they start school, people will say to you, well, what knowledge? Who should decide what it is that children should know? Shouldn't children just be free to explore and to use their imaginations and to develop as individuals? And this idea that you actually teach them something and you actually pick what you think is the best thing that children should know. And this goes for university students as well.
Sure.
Then you become some kind of elitist authoritarian who's imposing white culture or an elitist culture on students.
Right. I didn't realize that education was now an elitist culture, but I think in a lot of respects it is. But you can do both of those things at the same time, right? I mean, you can select what information to teach a child and expand their knowledge, while at the same time not stifling their creativity and ability to be themselves, right? I mean, you don't see those things as mutually exclusive.
No, in fact, I would actually say that the more knowledge you give them, then the more you enable them to be free to use their imaginations and to become creative, thinking, critical individuals, because they've got some basis to form that creativity, to spark that criticality. But the problem nowadays, I think, is that so many people, so many educators, bizarrely enough, think that you can miss out that first stage, that you can miss out teaching people any actual knowledge and just jump straight into the let's be critical, let's be imaginative, let's be creative bit without doing the groundwork first. And I think the more you actually teach people stuff, proper stuff, then the more you enable them to be free-thinking, creative, critical individuals.
So I know that this portion isn't totally your expertise, but as I was doing my research for this, I kept thinking I have a 2-year-old niece who is just going into whatever that's not elementary school.
Kindergarten?
Not even kindergarten, it's preschool, whatever. It's just to sort of socialize and take naps and stuff like that. It sounds pretty great, actually. How much do you know or pay attention to just sort of the process of younger learning? I know your focus is really on universities and stuff like that, but how much of just, it doesn't have to be 2 years old, but from 2 to say 18, how much of that is important to you and important to what leads to the stuff that you really care about at the university level?
I think it's all important. I think it's all really important. But the bizarre thing as well is that so many people who are involved in education, like I say, they talk the rhetoric of creativity, imagination. Child-centred is the language of the day. Everybody's got to be very, very child-centred. And yet when it comes to 2-year-olds, like you're talking about, we can't leave them alone. So, between 2 and 10 or whatever it is, it's like people need to micromanage every step of their day, everything they do. I mean, if I was running a nursery for 2-year-olds, I think I'd have nice toys, big open area, you know, this is for kindergarten kids, and leave them to get on with it, leave them to play, to form friendships, relationships, fall out, fight, take risks.
Which is all, that's a type of education. It's not necessarily the quest of knowledge per se at 5 years old, socializing, but socializing is education, right?
It is, but I think the best socializing is done, obviously, you know, you have a relationship with the parents, the relationship with the teachers, but ultimately kids need to be left alone as well. So my daughter's 10, in her school this week it's anti-bullying week.
Oh, Lord.
And I can guarantee you one thing, the poor teacher next week is going to have so many more kids coming to see him to say that they're being bullied, because essentially what these kids are being taught is that the normal everyday interactions that you have when you're 10, where you're falling out with people, making up with people, that is now bullying.
Yeah.
And instead of just leaving the kids to get on with it, to sort it out for themselves, they're being told, oh no, this is bullying.
Right, and
this
now
is
you have
kind
to
of
tell on them.
traumatic.
Yeah, you have to sort of tell on them.
Don't
and then,
sort it out for yourself, go and tell the teacher.
Yeah, so now I know a certain amount of people are going to hear that, because I've seen this when I've said something like that. I'm not pro-bullying, but I do understand that when I was a kid, there were some kids that I made fun of sometimes. There were some kids that made fun of me sometimes. I was playing stickball once in about 4th grade, and 2 guys that were much bigger than me from, I think, 2 grades over, literally picked me up and put me upside down in a garbage can. I am not making that up. So I was bullied and I did some bullying, but that's all what makes you a person.
It does, but I think what's changed is that the definition of bullying has gone from being something where we were quite clear about it. If somebody hits you, that was bullying, and you know, if you were being hit badly enough, you could go and tell the teacher, and you would expect an adult to intervene and to tell whoever was hitting you to stop. Suddenly now bullying has gone from being hitting to name calling. Now it's not even name calling, it's leaving someone out. So even if someone doesn't do anything bad to you, they just don't do anything to you.
Yeah.
That is now seen as being bullying as well.
God, that reminds me of in 3rd or 4th grade when, you know, if it was somebody's birthday, you'd have to bring cupcakes for everybody.
You see, we didn't have that in the UK at the time, but now it's getting like
now
that.
you have, we had that in the States for a long time. I remember very specifically, there was one kid who I really, really hated. And I was like, I don't want to give him a cupcake on my birthday, but you have to bring cupcakes for everybody because they're left out. What do you think that does to children for their formative years, this sort of, because all you're doing is giving them a fake reality. And I don't want to exclude kids, and I get kids can be tough and rough and mean and all that stuff. But what do you think it does for their formative ability to feel some pain, which is part of life?
Yeah, I mean, we use this term Snowflake Generation, and I think, I don't particularly like that term, but you can see how these kids are being then formed in school that nothing bad should ever happen to you. And if something bad does happen to you, it's the end of the world, and there is no way you can be expected to sort it out for yourself. You need to go and get somebody else to come in to sort this out for you.
Yeah.
And you know, the reason why I don't particularly like the term Snowflake Generation is because it lets older people off the hook. And these kids don't go to school when they're 5 begging for anti-bullying weeks. You know?
Right. It's being given to them by some older snowflakes.
Absolutely, yeah. This is their teachers and their head teachers who are saying, we are now going to have anti-bullying week, which I promise you won't be just a week. It will go on the whole year.
Right.
But this is what teachers are doing to them. So the teachers are telling them, essentially, you are so fragile, you cannot cope if somebody gives you a slightly odd look.
Yeah.
And you cannot sort that out for yourself and go and say to the person, why are you looking at me in that way? You need to get some help. So they're being conditioned to be scared of everything and everyone and never to be able to sort anything out for themselves. So these are then the kids who are then arriving on the college campus at university 4 or 5 years on from this, completely unable to cope forming relationships with each other.
Yeah. So before they get there, what do you think the learning process should be like? So now we've talked about the young kids. We've done the preschoolers. We've sort of got through elementary school. What's sort of a healthy high school education to you, where you're not necessarily going into the deep philosophical stuff, but maybe are, but you're not college level, but you're not a kid anymore.
Yeah.
Those interesting years of high school.
I think for me, one of the big problems at the moment with education is that the role of the teacher has become so confused with the role of the parents. And I think the job of the parent is to kind of love the kids, obviously, but to do things like teaching them about healthy eating, to bring them up in their values, to teach them about sex and relationships, for example. That should be the job of the parent, and it should be the job of the school to teach kids knowledge, to teach them about works of literature, about maths, geography, history, proper subjects. And the problem is these roles have become completely blurred. So the school is stepping in and teaching sex and relationships education, teaching about consent, teaching about bullying, about friendships. And the parents are being expected to teach the maths and teach the reading. Right. It's utterly bizarre.
Yeah.
And I think what a good school education should be like is both doing more in terms of more teaching, teaching more proper subject knowledge to kids, but then hands off as well. Don't teach them about sex and relationships. And this is a really controversial thing to say in the UK, but I don't think it should be the job of teachers to be telling kids about sex and relationships. It shouldn't be the job of the teachers to be running anti-bullying weeks. It shouldn't be the job of the school to tell kids what values to hold. So the teachers are kind of overstepping the mark, I think, but also not doing enough in terms of proper teaching of subject knowledge.
Right. So do you think there's no role for, say, a 7th grade health class where they're not necessarily teaching about sex per se, but they are teaching about STDs or they're teaching about drug use or something like that? You would say that's more of an academic thing. So you are okay with that, or you think that even that? Really?
I wouldn't have any of that at all. I mean, I think obviously there's a case for teaching kids the biology, and that should be done in a science lesson. But as soon as you move beyond the biology, you're putting a values framework into this. So even if you take healthy eating, for example, I do not think it should be the role of the school to teach kids what to eat. So I remember my own son when he was about 7, and we'd had a very, very busy week. It was very stressful. I got to Friday, and I'm like, oh, we'll get a pizza for dinner. So no, I can't.
There's gluten in there.
What's wrong with you? Oh no, we didn't have gluten in the UK at that time. Okay. This is a bit of a more recent.
Well, you had it, but you weren't talking about it.
We weren't talking about it.
Yeah.
But he'd been asked by the school to keep a food diary. This is like a 7-year-old boy who, spent so much time running around. He was so skinny and had been asked to write down everything that he'd had to eat and to kind of colour code it. Green for good, red for bad.
That actually sounds scary to me.
I just think it's completely overstepping the mark. And I'm like, well, come on, I'm your mother. If I want you to eat a pizza, you will eat a pizza, and I don't care how many calories it's got in it.
What kind of bizarro land that is where the mother has to trick the kid into eating a pizza?
I know.
That's really...
No. But I mean, I think the healthy eating's one thing, but I think when it comes into sex and relationships, it becomes even more horrible because it is a complete moral agenda that children are being taught, and this then feeds into universities where you have, certainly in the UK, demands for consent classes now. I mean, bizarrely compulsory consent classes, where these classes are mandatory. They must go to learn how to say no.
Right. So what do you do about the kid, so not who has a stable family and parents who are going to teach them the right things, but for a kid that really is not going to get that knowledge from them. They're not going to learn how to eat properly or how to not do drugs or know things about their body. All of that stuff, which is fully legit. And I understand you're drawing a line between sort of personal life and the schooling system, but how can we then help those kids that obviously need it? You're growing up, it's a confusing time. How do you, is there some role for the public in that?
I mean, firstly, I wouldn't overstate it. I mean, people always throw it, well, what about these really extreme examples, these kids who are kind of growing up in a garbage can or something like that and don't have any human interaction. I think you've got to be really, really careful. I mean, I think the vast majority of parents love their children and want the best for their children and do the best that they can. And it might not be textbook, and it might not be what all the experts say you should do, but there is no recipe at the end of the day for how to raise the perfect kid. And I think we fool ourselves if we think there is some recipe for raising the perfect kid. And I think, talking to them, loving them, that is enough, actually. And I think the vast majority of parents do that. But, there always will be one or two who perhaps don't have the advantages and don't get that love from their parents, and that's really sad. But do you know what? I think teachers are human and tend to love their jobs and also tend to be fond of the kids that they teach. And I think teachers over decades have always had an eye out. Certainly my own teaching experience, you would have half an eye out for the kid who was sitting there looking very quiet, withdrawn. If you thought someone had come to school without breakfast that day, and you would help them out. And you would do that on a very individual level. But the problem is when you start seeing your role as a teacher to do this to everyone in the class, that you've got to teach 30 kids about healthy eating, that takes up so much of your time and energy. That poor kid who's sitting there looking very withdrawn, who has come to school without breakfast, you actually don't even have the time to notice them and to give them the individual attention.
Yeah,
because you're so busy looking after all the worried well kids.
Yeah, that's such an interesting example of sort of the collective versus the individual, because by choosing the collective, in effect, you have to sort of neglect the people that need it the most. Which is, so that's really, it's well-intentioned, I suppose, that you want to teach these kids about how to eat right, and then who do you end up hurting the most is the kid that you could have focused on.
I think that's true. But I also think, there's just such a tendency nowadays to assume the worst of people and to assume that parents are not up to the job of raising their own kids. And that makes me feel very sad, because I think it's untrue. I think, like I said, people might not do it all according to some mythical rule book, but I think most parents are up to the job of raising their kids, and we're always so quick to focus on the one or two extremes, and luckily they are extremes. But I think most parents genuinely want the best for their kids and genuinely love their kids. And they may not be raising their kids in the best circumstances or circumstances that they've chosen, but they do want the best for their children. And I think we're just always so quick to look on the bad side.
Yeah. So speaking of wanting the best for their children, so you mentioned your daughter now, 10 years old, Anti-Bullying Week. In light of what you do for a living and the things that you care about, I mean, what do you say to her, either before this, during it, or after it?
Do you know what? These are real dilemmas that I face as a parent, because, before Anti-Bullying Week, I promise you I'm not making this up, but the week before Anti-Bullying Week was, I don't think you'll have this charity here in the US, but we have this charity NSPCC, which is the National Society for Prevention of Cruelty to Children. And the week before Anti-Bullying Week, this charity came into the school to do a week-long series of workshops about sexual abuse with 10-year-olds, and they have this initiative called PANTS, and it's about telling children that nobody should be allowed to touch you inside your underwear. Again, you could say, isn't this perhaps useful for the one or two children who are being sexually abused? But you take her school, 400 children in it, 395 of them do not need to have lessons in sexual abuse, and it creates worry and concern and fear in those children where they've got nothing to fear about, and it makes them suspicious of their parents. It makes them suspicious of adults who are wanting to help them, and it creates this kind of fear in the heads of young kids. So I get these letters home, this week is Sexual Abuse Prevention Week, this week is Anti-Bullying Week, Healthy Eating Week.
Yeah. Do they have just a regular week?
No,
is there ever just
never.
Sit back and enjoy life week? They don't have that, or we're not going to bother you this week, or
never.
That.
Over the years there's been some really bizarre things. So this was going back a few years now, but the school was into fair trade, and this is when she was like 6. So how can they get 6-year-olds to think about fair trade? So they made posters of bananas and pictures and cutting out and all this kind of thing.
Because kids, 6-year-olds really understand the international economics.
But this is the thing, because they don't understand it,
Right.
and there's no pretense of even teaching them about international economics and world trade.
Yeah.
It's just preaching, and it's just values. And so when they draw the poster, they're not expected to think critically about these things. They're expected just to buy into the values and demonstrate having met these values. So they all want pictures of kind of bananas and then farmers saying, I like fair trade and this kind of thing,
right,
with no degree of criticality there at all.
Right, and then if you dare criticize it, then
you haven't demonstrated that you've met the values, so you failed.
When did this happen? When did this stuff really happen? Because as I said before, when I was a kid, I bullied and I was bullied. I remember, that we were allowed to get into fights and all of that stuff, and you try to settle it, between the parents and not make everything national headline. When did this happen, and was it the exact same timing for the United States as it was for Britain?
I think probably quite similar in terms of timing. I think there's lots of different things going on here. I think you can see, for example, one very, very interesting study shows the geographical distance that children were allowed to go from their home on their own, away from home. And you can see how since the 1970s, year on year, that distance that children are allowed to go has become smaller and smaller. So essentially nowadays, it's pretty much their back garden.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about literally like their ability to get on the bike and ride around the neighborhood.
Absolutely,
slowly has been scaled
absolutely,
back.
Yeah, which is sad, very, very sad. And you can look at kind of high-profile cases, I think, in both the States and in the UK, of children who maybe have been abducted, and how this then spreads a fear through parents, and this idea that we're all kind of monitoring each other all the time. So I let my daughter walk to school on her own, or with another boy from her class. My fear, and this is very, very revealing, my fear was not for 1 second about anything that would happen to my daughter. You know, she's a very sensible girl, she'll be absolutely fine. My fear was, what will other parents think of me? And it's that idea that we're all kind of checking and monitoring each other all the time. And that's really unhealthy. But I think the big
What do some of the parents think of you? As long as we're going that route. I mean, you're public about this. This is what you do.
Oh yeah, she walks to school every day, and everybody drives past and sees her walking to school every day.
Yeah.
People will say funny things to me like, "Oh, you're so lucky. You can do that because your girl's so sensible." Well, actually, no, she's just a regular kid. She's just the same as your child. The reason why she's sensible is because I've allowed her.
Right, it's not a coincidence that you got this sensible kid.
Yeah, it's because I've let her take these risks that she now is this sensible child. But people will come up and they will say, "Oh, I saw her walking to school on her own today." And it's almost as if they just want me to know that they know that she's walking on her own.
Yeah. So it's like Big Brother stuff at a very micro level, because they start, it's almost a way of, it's not just that they're surveying the kids, in a way they're surveying the parents.
Absolutely.
And now you're all kind of watching each other. So it really, it sounds extremely perverted or something, like a perverse
But again,
ideology.
a lot of this comes from the schools. So kids will bring home, for example, homework projects that there is no possibility of the children being able to complete these projects on their own. And the homework projects are actually designed to involve the parents, and it's as if the school is then checking up on what are the parents doing. Are the parents being good parents? Have the parents heard the child read? So you have homeschool liaison officers who are employed specifically to work with the parents rather than working with the children, bringing the parents into school. And we have parenting classes in the UK now, and all parents are encouraged to go to these parenting classes. And it's almost as if you turn around and say, well, actually, do you know what? I think I'm doing a good enough job. And I don't think I need any of this extra help or advice. That in and of itself then marks you out as somebody who's not good enough. Right,
so by doing a good job, thus not wanting to spend extra time in a class that you have no need for, you then are thought of as the outsider. Something's wrong with those guys. They don't want to be in the parenting class. Because they're not good parents.
Absolutely.
I mean, this is crazy stuff.
Yeah.
So how do you peel back some of this stuff?
I think you've got to. And you just have to stand up and take that risk. And you just have to say, well, no, she's 10. My daughter, she's walking to school, and that's it. End of story. And the time I think it becomes very, very difficult for me personally, the time it becomes very difficult is with things like these anti-bullying weeks and, say, sex education classes, because I obviously have strong opinions about these things, but I'm also aware that I don't want to single my daughter out, and I don't want her to have to carry the can for my political views. And most of the time I just let these things go, and then I'll ask her about it afterwards and see if there's anything that she wants to talk to me about, but I won't single her out. There's one or two things where I do. So for example, I was talking about the healthy eating thing, and they do this thing in the UK where they weigh and measure all children when they're in their first year at school and when they're in their final year at school. So they can send a letter home to the parents to say, you know, your child is obese, your child is overweight, and you need to do something about this, and here's some exercise classes. And some.
Because you couldn't have figured that out on your own. No way.
No.
You couldn't have bought a scale and maybe fed your kid differently. That would be impossible.
Absolutely. I mean, that's the assumption, that you need somebody to give you an official letter to say your child is overweight. You know, it's horrendous. So I withdrew her from that, and you know, she's not going to do that. But most of the time, you have to let it go, and then you just have to hope that your children pick up enough of your own values that eventually they begin to think quite critically of these things themselves.